Let's continue into part 6 where we take a deep dive into the working of the real estate agent's disclosure. So, I told you Rule 58A.0104 is the agency agreements and agency disclosure rule. Now, folks, it is a very detailed rule, and so let me just give you some of the big pieces of it, okay? It is the rule that states that all agency agreements in North Carolina will ultimately have to be in writing. It is the rule that states that buyer agency agreements can start off initially as oral buyer agency agreements, but would have to be reduced to writing no later than presentation of an offer. Now, that's the one rule that people are wondering if the commission's going to rewrite and change, because one of the big things coming from the NAR settlement coming down the pipeline is that you will not be able to operate without a written buyer agency agreement. So we'll talk more about that. Now, it is also the rule that says that we have to give out the working with real estate agents disclosure at first substantial contact. But folks, let me make sure you understand a very important word in regard to the working with real estate agents disclosure. It is required in sales transactions only. The working with real estate agents disclosure is required in sales transactions only. Well, folks, are every transaction that we ever do sales transactions? Think about it. No, right? If you were assisting a tenant in finding a rental, is anybody buying or selling? If you were assisting a property owner and managing their property, is anybody buying or selling? So if you get a test question that says that the working with real estate agents disclosure is required in all transactions, that's not a true statement. It is required in all sales transactions, both residential and commercial. Now, the trigger for most of these times that you're going to give the working with real estate agents disclosure in sales transactions is that first substantial contact. We're going to talk about it. The only exception, as I told you, if you're a buyer's agent, it's initial contact, and it works a little bit differently. So we're going to talk about the different ways that these disclosures can happen. So when we start talking agency disclosure, the reason this is so important, as we said, if you're not with us, you're against us. And people need to know, are we going to be working with you or for you? Are we not? Because that's the honesty and fairness piece. I can't take you to the cleaners unless I explain to you that I can and will take you to the cleaners if you don't hire me. And so the trigger for this is any time that we hit first substantial contact. We start getting into that confidential territory. Price, terms, motivation. In other words, anything that could be used in negotiations. Okay? I have to be under contract within 3 days. I have a loan payoff of $100,000. I need $100,000 only to sell my property. I'm getting a job transfer. I'm going through divorce. Anything like that could give away bargaining positions, and that's the deadline. Folks, understand that there's nothing stopping you in the real world from giving it sooner. When we meet a buyer, we could just give it to them the day we meet them. Nobody's going to be mad at us for that. But the deadline is for substantial contact. Now, let me give you a scenario here, folks. Let's talk about open houses. At this point in your career, I hope every single one of you are considering them because they are a lead generation activity, but do them safely, okay? They are one of those things that have inherent risks with them. But let's talk about open houses, folks. If I was holding an open house and I had 10,000 people come through my door, God, I hope I got some good leads. But if I had 10,000 people come through and every single one of them, the conversation went like this. Oh my God, are you the listing agent? No, I'm just holding the open house for the listing agent. They work in my firm. Oh, well, it's such a pretty house. Oh my God, it really is such a pretty house. They say, how many bedrooms? I said, well, 3. How many bathrooms? 3 as well, and there's a bonus room upstairs. They said, what type of countertops is that? I said, oh, it's snowberry granite or something like that. And then they say, oh, well, do you mind if we look around? I said, no, go ahead. Let me know if you have any questions. Folks, if every single one of my 10,000 conversations went like that, did I ever have to give anybody a working with real estate agents disclosure? No. None of that was confidential. Nothing. Okay? Even if they said something like, oh, I love this granite. Folks, that's not first substantial contact. I love lots of things. Doesn't mean I can afford them. Okay? I love Lamborghinis. I don't have one. All right? You've really got to look for things that can be used in a negotiation. I have to have this house. Okay, we got an issue now. I have to be under contract in 5 days. So let's say that somebody walks in and the conversation goes exactly like before, but then they end it with, well, listen, I love this house and I got to be under contract on something quick because my wife caught me sleeping with the secretary and we're going through a nasty divorce. Folks, have we had first substantial contact now? Yeah. Very awkward first substantial contact, right? Like, all right, that goes back to some of those oversharers y'all were talking about earlier. Some people just like to overshare. It's like, well, excuse me, sir, I didn't need all that information. But so understand the deadline is then. So what you really should do, folks, when anybody starts a conversation, you get super weird. You look at them and you go, how about that? And you go, shh. Boop. Don't tell me your secrets. Let me give you the working with real estate agents disclosure. Now, don't actually touch their lips because they'll probably punch you in the face. But you get what I'm saying. You stop them and say, please, before you go any further, let me explain how agency and agency representation works and give you this working with real estate agents disclosure to protect you. And so understand that it is always a written disclosure. It is that very specific form. Okay? Written disclosure. So you give it to them, and it's not enough to just give it to them. Then you have to go further, and you have to review it with them. And then after that, you would ask them if you could be their agent. Now, folks, I want you to think of this, and I'm going to go on a tangent because I think if I give you some more in-depth discussions on dual agency and some considerations, I will reinforce and solidify those right here, right now, before we ever get to the dual agency section. But before I get there, I want you to think of the working with real estate agents disclosure as a menu, folks. When you go to a restaurant, you get a menu, and that tells you what is available. After you go through the menu and you understand what's on the menu, you've got to pick something. And so please be aware that the working with real estate agents disclosure never creates a relationship. Never ever. You would then need an agency agreement to create the relationship thereafter, if you can get one. It's just the menu. If it's on the menu, you can pick it. If it's not on the menu, you can't pick it. Now, here's where I want to explain, agency a little bit more in depth, folks, because I kind of gave you the introduction to it when we were talking about the omissions and misrepresentations examples. But let me just explain exclusive and dual again. Folks, I told you, if I say exclusive buyer agency, who's the only person you care about?
Your client.
Be more specific.
Buyer.
The buyer. Yeah, exclusive buyer agency means we only care about the buyer. If I say exclusive seller agency, that means we only care about who? Seller. And then if I say dual agency, that means we are obliged to care about both. And so, folks, this is where I'm telling you, when I say dual agency, I want you to think of being, you ready for this? Bound and gagged and worthless. You can't do anything at all. Okay, somebody has tied you up and put something in your mouth. You can't say nothing. You're useless. Because if you say anything, you probably screwed up. Folks, I want you to think about this. And I'm going to give you a scenario to help you understand this, because I think now's a good time, and then I'll get into the working with real estate agents disclosure. I'm going to use y'all as an example. So I'm going to say Caroline. Caroline, you work for ABC Realty. And you get a phone call from a seller. It's a very ugly C, but you get the idea. You get a phone call from a seller, and they hire you to list their property. And so the seller's house is 123 Main Street, because I'm oh so creative. And you list this property for $400,000, and your seller client tells you that they would be ecstatic with an offer of $375,000. And so you list this property. You put your sign in the yard. It's got your face out there. You're smiling in your photo on the sign, and you got your phone number on it. So you list this property, and Katina drives past you, drives past the house, should I say, and she calls your phone number, and she is an unrepresented buyer. And she says, well, Caroline, I just saw your listing at 123 Main Street. It is beautiful. I would love to see it. Caroline, are you going to show this listing to Katina?
Yes, I believe I can show it to her because it's my listing.
Sure. Now, what are you going to do before you show it to her?
Explain to her the working with real estate agents and let her know she can be unrepresented, but she probably shouldn't be.
Yeah, there you go. Because yet again, if you're showing anybody a property, a one-off person a property, you've got to disclose agency. First substantial is happening. First substantial conduct is happening. So she's going to say, well, Katina, I'm the listing agent, so I do work for the seller. Please understand that you can have a buyer's agent. There's people who work for sellers like I do. You can be unrepresented, okay? And then, of course, there's dual agency and designated dual agency. And so just be aware of that. So if Katina understands all these things, then, of course, Caroline can show her the house as an unrepresented buyer. And so she does. She takes Katina. She goes and shows her this property. And after she gets done looking at this property, she looks at Caroline. She says, I love this property, and I'd like to put in an offer. Could Caroline put in an offer on behalf of Katina, the unrepresented buyer?
Yes.
Yeah. Once again, you could, but just like that seller sub-agency scenario, she's not going to give her any advice. She's going to say, remember, you're on your own. You tell me what you want to write, and I'll write it in the blanks, and I'll hand it to my seller. Everybody okay with that statement so far?
Yes.
Okay, let's take this one step further. Katina says, well, Caroline, how about this? Is there a way that you could represent me and the seller, and I could hire you to be my agent as well? Can we do that?
You probably could. I wouldn't choose to do that. I don't think it's wise because you would have to get permission from the seller first because you're representing them. They would have to give you permission to get out of the exclusive to represent the buyer as well in a neutral relationship. So now I'm not looking out for their best interest, but I'm neutral in both relationships.
So very good insights, and we're going to provide some clarity on all those things. And the way that some of these things flow is a little more straightforward than formal. But yeah, so can we all agree it can happen? Yes? Okay, so let's just play out this scenario for a learning point here. Let's say that you get permission from the seller, you get permission from the buyer, Katina, and everybody agrees. And so now Katina hires you as well. So you are a what? A dual agent. Because you're representing the buyer and the seller in the same transaction. Okay, well, now that Katina has hired you, you're helping her over here in buyer land, and Katina starts telling you her secrets. Katina says, well, listen, I love this listing you have, and I have to have it, and I've got $600,000 in the bank that I can spend on a house. But, of course, I do want the best deal in every way, shape, and form. I don't know why I put the K here since I actually wrote out 600,000. I do want the best deal in every way, shape, and form. And so here's what Katina says after she tells you these things. She says, Caroline, what should I offer on your listing?
I can't tell her. I can't advise her.
Can't tell her, can't advise her.
But I can provide market analysis for her.
Can provide market analysis for her.
Well, actually, it would probably be available for the listing agent as well as for the seller as well as the buyer, because then both of them would have information to make their own decision, but I would not be able to advise them either way.
Okay, so Caroline says wouldn't be able to advise them either way. And so she looks at you, Katina, and she says, I can't tell you nothing. And Katina says, well, this is bullcrap. I thought you were working for both of us. Help me out here. Tell me what to offer. Folks, anybody want to do anything different?
When you offer designated dual agency, would that then make it possible?
hold off on that. We're going to talk about that in just a second. In this particular instance, it's not really an option. I'll explain why in a few moments. But it may be something that could come up, but we'll get there. Any other insights? So, here's the thing. This is a very weird situation, but this goes back to what I was telling you before. Folks, if you have loyalties to both, you owe old card to both, confidentiality to both, Caroline knows that her sellers would accept less than 400. Specifically, they would take 375. And Caroline knows that the buyer, Katina, has $600,000 in the bank. But if she suggests anything less than $400,000, she's hurt the seller. If she suggests anything over 375, she's hurt the buyer. And so this goes back to the bound and gagged and worthless. And so Caroline was right. Folks, you can't give any advice. You know what the only appropriate response is in this scenario? Now, if you ladies who have longer hair, you might be able to do this. For me, I'm going to have to just do my beard. What you do is you just take your hair and you start twirling it a little bit and you look at me and say, I don't know, what do you want to offer? That's what you say. Because you can't advise them. Because if you help one, you hurt the other. So it's, you know what it's like? You know when you and your significant other can't figure out where to go to dinner, right? I don't know, what do you want for dinner? I don't know, what do you want for dinner? I don't know, what do you want for dinner? Right? You just go back and forth until one of you dies. And so the only acceptable thing is to say, what do you want to offer? And of course, Katina says, well, I don't like that. I thought you were representing both of us. And she's like, I'm sorry. If I help one, I hurt the other. Now, let me tell you where a lot of people have a misconception, even when they start to grasp this concept. Let's say that Katina comes up with a number. Let's say that the seller counters. Let's say that we finally get it under contract. Folks, if Caroline suggests that Katina get a home inspection, she just hurt the seller. If Caroline tells the seller that they don't need to make repairs, she just hurt the buyer. Do you see why dual agency is the most worthless hunk of junk that ever did exist? It is a steaming pile of hot garbage. You are bound and gagged and worthless. And if you don't believe me, when we get into the listing agreement and the buyer agency agreement in a little bit, you will see the provision in there that it says, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit, are you sure you're sure? Are you sure you're sure you're sure? Are you sure you want to do this even though it sucks? And please be aware that you can hire an attorney to do our job for us, our job that we can't do for you, but you still have to pay us. Folks, I'm paraphrasing, but that's basically what it says. It's the most worthless sack of garbage that ever did exist. Okay? Now, here's where I'm going to throw you a little bit of a curveball. Okay? Let's pretend one thing here. Caroline still works for the seller. Caroline has the listing with ABC Realty, 123 Main Street, listed at $400,000. Seller would take $375,000. Katina, instead of calling Caroline, she called Sam with XYZ Realty. I'm sorry, with ABC Realty as well. I'm sorry. Forgot who we were dealing with. Let me rewrite this. She called Sam, who is also with ABC Realty. Okay? But she just found her number, found her on Zillow, called her. And she says, Sam, I'm interested in 123 Main Street. I'd like to put in an offer. Her and Sam, have a relationship together. She tells Sam the same thing. She says, Sam, I have $600,000 in the bank. What should I offer on this property? So what's Sam going to tell Katina?
Well, Sam can advise her on what the best offer would be, but that's a designated agency.
Yeah, I feel like I'm still a seller sub-agent.
You don't have to be a seller sub-agent, because if the buyer hired you in some capacity, that means we are looking after the buyer, but there's some nuances to it. So you're not a seller sub-agent. folks, go ahead, Matt.
So, okay, so are Sam and Katina, is that exclusive in this scenario? Or Katina just called it?
I'm,
If Katina just calls in and it's not exclusive, shouldn't she say, like, if she has that 600,000 info, shouldn't she say that's what you should put down?
Okay, I assumed she already signed a contract with her as exclusive agent.
and so here's where I'll clarify something now. I'll give you a little precursor to it. When I talk about the word exclusive, I told you there's two different contexts. If I say exclusive seller agent or exclusive buyer agent, that means that we're only looking after the seller or we're only looking after the buyer. But we do not ever promise to stay exclusive. When you fill out an exclusive buyer agency agreement, that word exclusive means they can't have another agent. When they fill out an exclusive listing agreement, that means they can't have another agent. But we've never made the promise in those agency agreements to remain exclusive. And so when we get permission to do dual agency, even though all of our agency agreements start out as exclusive in North Carolina, we have this power. If they say dual agency is okay, we can toss exclusivity out the window and we can represent both as long as they've put it in writing that they're okay with it. And so I'm intentionally leaving details out here. But here's something you have to understand. So I'm going to go ahead and make this very abundantly clear. Folks, nothing changes here. This is the exact same. Because if Caroline works for ABC Realty and Sam works for ABC Realty, there is still this territory of bound and gagged and worthless. Because I want you to think about something. Who is actually the agent?
The firm.
The firm. So if Sam, who is by proxy ABC, gives advice to Katina, then ABC has hurt Caroline's seller. If Caroline gives advice to the seller, then ABC has hurt Katina. Does that make sense? Folks, it is not, this is the biggest misconception that people have, is that if there's two agents, it's automatically designated. It's not.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
It's not. This is still dual. Designated from a textbook point of view has to be specifically, intentionally appointed and created. Unless by textbook, the BIC says you are working for the seller, go for blood for them. You are working for the buyer, go for blood for them. It starts out as useless nonetheless. It is no different from the first scenario with Caroline representing both by herself. It's still just dual agency. We would have to specifically and intentionally create designated. And so Sam couldn't give a suggestion on how to get a better deal. Sam couldn't suggest home inspection. Sam couldn't suggest any of that to Katina. Because if she did, she's hurting the seller. And ABC promised to look after the seller. Now, in this scenario, if it's not designated, let me ask you a question. Would it be okay for Caroline to tell Sam that the seller was willing to take less than $400? And would it be okay for Sam to tell Caroline that Katina had $600,000 in cash?
I believe that's okay as long as it doesn't get the seller or buyer.
I would say no. Oh, is it?
It is, but here's the thing. Once again, there's textbook and there's cautionary. From a textbook point of view, folks, if you're not allowed to use it, where's the harm in everybody knowing those secrets? If nobody in the firm can advocate on behalf of anybody, why would it matter if everybody knew that Caroline's seller would take $375? Everybody in the firm couldn't share that detail. So everybody knowing is not a risk, as long as they know what the rules and policies are. Same thing for Katina. If we all knew that Katina had $600,000, where's the risk if nobody's able to use that information? So legally speaking, can we share that information in the firm? Yes. But to Caroline's point, in the real world, folks, I'm telling you, most agents don't know this crap at all. Most BICs don't know this crap at all. And so it's not adhered to the most finite and legal way. So would it be a stupid idea from a real world point of view to share that information? Of course, because then somebody's going to use it thinking it's okay. And then they're going to be in violation of license laws and commission rules. And then somebody's going to be open to disciplinary action because people don't understand agency. Now, I'm going to do this a little bit backwards because I did explain agency, but I want you to see something here. And then we're going to go over the working with the real estate agents disclosure. And that's where we're going to wrap up the day. But because it literally articulates everything that I just told you about agency, I think it was important for you to hear it first and see it solidified by the commission. But let me give you a visual to make you feel warm and fuzzy, because this is typically the point where it's okay, Caroline, I just muted you, you're fine. This is typically the point where some people start to get a little confused because they're like, well, I don't know, that doesn't sound, but I'm going to show you something. If you go back to the Real Estate Commission's website, and back under publications where we found the license law and commission rule book, folks, once upon a time, the working of the real estate agents disclosure was a pamphlet. It was a brochure, and it was a trifold, and you may still see some floating around your offices. And what they did is they made it so much more clear. And so the new one is better. But they took the old one and they turned it into a Q&A brochure on working with the real estate agents. So if you find it right here, working with real estate agents, PDF brochure format. And what they did is, folks, they expanded on it and they really wanted to make a point and drive something home. And so you know what they did? They added pictures. Folks, pictures is how we teach grade school children. But this is such a confusing topic. This is the only thing they could come up with. And I'd say it was pretty daggum effective. So look at this. If we are dealing with two brokerage firms, and let's just call the red one Keller Williams and let's call the blue one Coldwell Banker, okay? If we're dealing with two brokerage firms, it is always exclusive representation. That means Keller Williams only cares about the buyer in the transaction. Coldwell Banker only cares about the seller in the transaction. You cool with that? This is always exclusive, and you can never have dual agency with two brokerage firms. Also, I always like to point out the very desirable fashion choices they made. I got the dog tag here, and I got this super eclectic scarf, okay? For some reason, the agents are naked. I think that's a violation in and of itself, but I'm just pointing that out. I don't know why they don't have any clothes on. I don't know. But this is always exclusive representation. Now, when we start looking at dual agency, here's what I just showed you with Caroline. Okay, Caroline works for ABC, Keller Williams, wherever, and she's representing the buyer and the seller in the same transaction. One licensee can work with the buyer and the seller in the same transaction, even one licensee in a firm or a sole proprietor working independently. Now, there's no technical name for this other than just a type of dual agency, but I like to call this true dual, meaning one licensee is in fact representing the buyer and the seller in the same transaction. And I want you to notice what is happening. Do you see that? What are they doing with the buyer and the seller?
Assisting both of them.
Assisting both of them, holding hands. I mean, not like really finite holding hands, but they're assisting both. And so, of course, there's this divided loyalty. It means you're bound and gagged and worthless because you're caring about both. But look right here. Here is Sam. Here is Caroline. And they all work for ABC Realty, Keller Williams, Coldwell Banker, whoever. But every single one of them is holding hands. It's no different. You are still bound and gagged and worthless, whether it be true dual or just dual, because it's the firm that's the agent. And if either licensee helps the party, the firm has hurt the other party. Does that make sense? So designated is where we specifically and intentionally say we're not doing the kumbaya holding hands thing. We are going for blood, but it's specifically created. So you, Caroline, go for blood for you were the seller. So you, Caroline, go for blood for the seller, and you, Sam, go for blood for the buyer that was Katina. And because we've now stated it, it acts like exclusive, but it's still a type of dual because the firm represents the buyer and the seller in the same transaction. The reason why so many licensees get caught up on this and confused on this is because most firms practice designated, and more than that, most firms default to designated. It's not even a discussion. Oh, you brought the buyer, you brought the seller, go for blood, try to kill each other. That's how most firms default. So it's such an out of sight, out of mind thing that licensees get confused and they start thinking, oh, there's two agents, it's always designated. It's not. But so many firms default to that's what it tends to be. Does that make sense? Now, I'll tell you, there's some firms out there that have some very silly policies in regard to this. I'll tell you a funny story. I'll tell you two funny stories, and then we'll go back to the working with real estate agents disclosure. I have a friend of mine who is an educator as well, who has his own firm, and he has a policy. And this is, under most circumstances, this is really dumb, but he knows what he's doing, and I'll tell you why it works. Folks, there are times when you cannot do designated dual agency, and we're going to talk about them in a little bit, but I'll go ahead and give you one. If you've already received confidential information about the opposite party, you cannot be a designated dual agent. And so my friend's firm has 4 people. Him, his 2 friends, and his mama. Well, folks, there's some chatty Cathys. So their firm has a policy that they don't do designated. Why? Because it's pretty much a guarantee that they've all gossiped about their people already. And so designated would never be allowed. They'd already have confidential information. So that makes sense. But then I had a student one time, great guy, who was an appraiser, came through my class, and I just got him and his wife for a CE again this year. And he told me, he's like, well, Seth, I joined a firm, and my firm has a policy where we don't do designated, we only do dual. I said, okay, that seems silly. Let's talk about this. And so he told me a story where he had a listing, and it was a very popular listing at the time. It had like 20-something showings, and he had somebody who was interested in seeing it. So that would have been true dual, because he would have been representing the buyer and the seller in the same transaction. And then there was 3 other licensees in his firm, for a total of 4 people from his firm, including him, who had buyers interested. And he said his firm didn't do designated, they only did dual. And his name was Richard. I said, okay, Richard, let me ask you a question. When these 3 affiliated licensees from your firm go and see these houses, and they get done, and let's say their buyers want to put in offers, are these agents, do you think, going to give advice to these buyers? He said, oh, yeah, absolutely. And I said, then you're doing it wrong. Because if your firm has a policy that says we don't do designated, you should never be giving advice in that scenario. And this is where there is a slew of stupid out there, folks. There are BICs creating firms that do not understand the difference between dual and designated dual, when you can, when you can't. And they're just digging themselves a hole to bury themselves in when the commission catches up to them. Now I'm going to show you the new working with real estate agents disclosure, folks. And you're going to realize that this, and I say new, it's been around for several years now, but it was new at the time. You're going to realize that this is exactly what I've just been teaching you. It should sound exactly like it. So if you go to disclosure forms, working with real estate agents, now that is one page for sellers, 1 page for buyers. So let's start with the sellers. Let's hit some key points here. First and foremost, as I already told you, this form is required for use in all sales transactions, including residential and commercial. Not all transactions, but sales. So this is a side for sellers. And here's what it says. This form is not a contract. Signing this disclosure only means you have received it, so it never creates a relationship. In real estate sales transactions, it's important that you understand whether an agent represents you. Real estate agents are required to, 1, review this form with you at first substantial contact, meaning before asking for or receiving your confidential information, and 2, give you a copy of the form after you sign it. This is for your own protection. Do not share any confidential information with a real estate agent or assume that the agent is acting on your behalf until you have entered into a written agreement with the agent to represent you. Otherwise, the agent can share confidential information with others. Well, folks, I want you to go back to the conversation that Ashley and I had when she wouldn't hire me because she watches HGTV and Selling Sunset. Some of you may have felt bad for her when I took her to the cleaners, but folks, if I gave her this and did my job, she should have known to never tell me what she would pay. But that's the thing. Some agents don't do a good job of explaining this, and that's where you're going to get yourself in trouble. You've got to look them in the face and say, don't tell me your secret, stupid, or I'll take you to the cleaners. Now, this next part says, and this is the agent. A lot of mistakes are made. People think that the buyers or the sellers are checking these boxes. No, we are checking these boxes. It says, check all relationship types below that may apply to the seller. Well, folks, what does that mean? That may apply to the seller.
If they're selling, if they're buying, what type of relationship it'll be.
Well, and there's the one side for sellers, there's the one side for buyers. So, of course, we knew they were on the seller side, that we're only going to be talking to a seller. But what else could I mean? What?
All the options are available.
All the options that are available. Be a little more specific.
Well, like you stated, the menu. of what we
Sure.
have.
But how do we know if it's on the menu or off the menu?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure I understand. It's on here, so you're covering all your bases before you even know what kind of relationship they want to establish with you, or potentially.
Sure. But these are not always going to be options.
Okay.
So let me zoom out here so you can see what's on there. Seller agency, dual agency, designated, and working with an unrepresented seller. So check all relationship types below that may apply to this seller. What does that mean? It may apply. Let me help you out, folks. Do you think there are firms out there who only work with sellers? Sure. Probably. Do you think there are firms out there that only work with buyers? Sure. Folks, if I am a firm that only works with sellers, and I'm giving this to a seller, is there any potential of dual agency or designated dual agency ever arising? No. Because if our firm only works with sellers, that means we would never be representing the best interest of a buyer, and ergo, all we would have as an option is seller agency. Exclusive seller agency. Does that make sense? So when I say check all that may apply to the seller, does our firm offer it? Even a firm that works with buyers and sellers, if they have policies that state we don't do dual agency, don't check that. It's not going to arise with you. If it could arise, check the box. If your firm does all, you're going to check, okay, I could be your exclusive seller agent. I could be a dual agent for you. I could be a designated dual agent. Check them all. But if your firm doesn't offer everything, don't check it all. It's what could arise. And we're not even asking to pick. It's, let's explain these things. They could end up happening. Does that make sense? But not every firm does these things. So for most instances, we're going to check these three and leave that last one blank unless they were wanting to be unrepresented like Ashley was in our scenario. Now, folks, hopefully this is going to sound like what I was talking about earlier with that exclusive word. If I say seller agency, the agent who gave you this form and the agent's firm must enter into a written listing agreement with you before they begin to market your property for sale. If you sign the listing agreement, the listing firm and its agents would then represent you. The buyer would either be represented by an agent affiliated with a different real estate firm or be unrepresented, right? Because that's your only options. If the only person we care about is the seller, that means the buyer is either unrepresented or represented by another firm. Because if we cared about both, we don't call it exclusive seller agency. We would then call it dual. Does that make sense? So then when we get into dual agency will occur if your listing firm has a buyer client who wants to purchase your property. If you agree in a written agency agreement, the real estate firm and any agent with the same firm, meaning the entire company, would be permitted to represent you and the buyer at the same time. Here's the key piece. A dual agent's loyalty would be divided between you and the buyer, but the firm and its agents must treat you and the buyer fairly and equally and cannot help you gain an advantage over the other party. Does that sound like the bound and gagged and worthless that I just taught you? Can't help or hinder anybody. And then designated. If you agree in a written agency agreement, the real estate firm would represent both you and the buyer, but the firm would designate one agent to represent you and a different agent to represent the buyer. Each designated agent would be loyal only to their client. And so at that point, it's still dual, but we say you go for blood for the buyer, you go for blood for the seller, and the rest of us are going to sit on the sidelines, bound and gagged and worthless. You two go for blood. The rest of us are sitting on the sidelines. Now, of course, this last one is if you were dealing with an unrepresented seller. Well, folks, we talked about this. If you're already representing a buyer client and they're interested in a for sale by owner, you would need to give this to the seller at initial contact. The buyer agent working with an unrepresented seller, or a FSBO. The agent who gave you this form will not be representing you and has no loyalty to you. The agent will represent only the buyer. Do not share any confidential information with this agent. What's that? Now, the buyer side, and hopefully this sounds exactly like what I just taught you, and we're going to build into the layers when we talk about sellers and buyers and the agency agreements, but the buyer side is almost identical. I will point out a couple of things. Folks, first I want you to look at this section right here. Somewhere in here, there is one word that's different than the seller side. Let's see how smart you are, see if you can find it. And if you can't find it, it doesn't mean you're not smart. I'm just making a game out of it.
The written agreement.
There you go. And this one, it says, have entered into an agreement with the agent to represent you. On the seller side, there was the word written. Why? Because the way the law sits right now, you can have an oral buyer agency agreement. That's the only difference on this one. Now, or at least in that paragraph, but the buyer agency piece, you'll see the clarification here. So if we were talking about buyer agency, if you agree, the agent who gave you this form and the agent's firm would represent you as a buyer's agent and be loyal to you. You may begin with an oral agreement, but your agent must enter into a written buyer agency agreement with you before making a written offer or oral offer for you. And the seller would either be represented by an agent affiliated with a different real estate firm or be unrepresented, because otherwise we wouldn't call it buyer agency. If we cared about both, it'd be dual. And then the dual agency is the same. The designated dual agency is the same. Now this last one, this is what you would have given Ashley in that scenario. When Ashley says, I don't need an agent. I watch HGTV and Selling Sunset. Just show me the pretty house. I would have looked at her and said, okay, let me remind you, Ashley, that means I will be assisting you as an unrepresented buyer and I'll be working as a seller sub-agent. So that's what she is, unrepresented buyer, and I'm acting as a seller sub-agent. The agent who gave you this form may assist you in your purchase, but will not be representing you and has no loyalty to you. The agent will represent the seller. Do not share any confidential information with this agent. So when Ashley told me her secrets, I took her to the cleaners because I was supposed to look her in the face and say, don't you tell me nothing. Otherwise, I'm going to use and abuse you. Sounds like what I've been teaching you thus far, right? Does this make sense? And folks, understand, and we're going to talk about it a little more tomorrow, typically for like the last 10 minutes. Of course, it's 8 minutes now at this point. I'll give you some time to just chit-chat with me about anything you want to talk about. But understand that a lot of people think of this as a burden. When you really realize that this is designed to protect the public, it's very easy to give this to somebody, right? And you can sometimes make it funny, too. You say, hey, listen, I know we just met, but understand the agency is a very complex thing, and I don't want anything to happen to you, and I want to make sure that you are protected. So let me explain how agency works, and so that way you know that you shouldn't tell me any confidential information unless you think you're going to hire me. And you give them this document, and you cover yourself. It's really not as hard as people have a tendency to think it is. And now, of course, it's just one of those extra things that until you get used to it, it's uncomfortable. But it's really useful, and it sometimes sets you apart because you explain to people that you're actually looking after their best interest. And if you do that, then you seem like a much more trustworthy person versus the agent who didn't give you this until like way after you gave all this confidential information. Because now there's questions like, oh, were you trying to screw me over? You know? So we got 7 minutes left, folks. I typically like to just open the floor, whatever y'all would like to talk about for the last 7 minutes. It doesn't have to be about class. It can be about, licensing and, careers and, the rain in Spain falling mainly in the plain. Whatever y'all want to talk about for the last 6 minutes now.
Well, I like the little spiel you just gave on how you introduced this into the conversation with a buyer or a seller, is it possible for you to like type something up and just give it to us? Because it's like a skit. We don't have skits nowadays.
So I actually have a lot, and it's funny because I'll tell you the other cool thing that we're going to talk about, Katina, and I've got it somewhere and I've got to share it because I've had that question a lot. One of the biggest mistakes that people make, aside from the working with real estate agents disclosure, is they think that oral buyer agency agreements are just let's go see some pretty houses. The way that the rules are written, they are supposed to be express agreements. We're going to talk about that tomorrow, meaning they need to be clearly stated. And so I have a spiel where I teach people exactly what you need to say with a oral buyer agency agreement. And because I can just roll it off the tongue so much, every time I say it, people are like, oh my God, can I get a copy of that? The thing is,
Yes.
as an instructor, I'm a nerd. I record every single class. So I could absolutely get you copies of any of this stuff in an audio format, have it dictated or whatever. So I'll look at it and I'll be happy to share it.
Okay, thank you.
For
That'd
sure.
be very helpful for the new people.
Yeah.
The newbies.
And we'll do some of that tomorrow too, where I give you some more examples and I'll record it and share it too.
Okay, perfect. And I do have a question about like when they're going to expand a road or the whole 540 loop thing and people that want to buy properties that may be affected by that. Should we go to like the master plan for this county or the city to look at stuff like that?
Love that question, Katina. That is such an advanced question, and I love it. The thing is, folks, one of the biggest and best things that you can do, and we all get guilty of being busy. We all get guilty of only focusing on money-making activities. But one of the best things you can do to be a proficient broker in your area is go to your planning board meetings, look at your planning board website, look at the proposals, the minutes, look at the master plan, look at the DOT projects, and it takes some time to get used to navigating these things. But Google is your friend. So let's say that you're really focusing on Raleigh or Wake County. Just go to Google, type in Wake County Planning Board meetings. They are open to the public. They're in person, sometimes via Zoom. You can do the same thing, Wake County DOT, Raleigh DOT, North Carolina Department of Transportation, and start looking and doing research. Because the more you know, the better protected you are. And I can't stress that enough. That is such a fantastic question. So if you just start getting kind of well versed, and it takes time to learn it, folks. We've known this for 9 years, and I still learn stuff every single day. Every municipality is different. Every zoning board is different. Every planning board is different. And so you've got to start learning a lot about all the areas you're going to potentially do business in. And the more you learn, the better protected you are. Yeah.
Okay. One more from me and I'll stop.
Okay.
So
I love it.
Can we use the deed to figure out the acreage or the square footage of a property as well as the square footage of the home?
Excellent question yet again. We're going to teach you that tomorrow in the working with sellers section. What the commission says is we have an obligation to know how to measure houses, which is why I'll teach you how to measure houses tomorrow, and to verify square footage of houses. However, they consider the size of the lot outside of our scope of expertise, and we are allowed to rely on surveys, plat maps, and deeds for the acreage or the square footage of a lot. But the homes we are obligated to verify ourselves. The only acceptable source of square footage is us measuring or hiring somebody more advanced than ourselves to measure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.